before we get into it today, I wanted to give you a little bit of legal fine print. So I feel like the last couple of weeks, God's been saying a lot of stuff to me, and I'm not 100% sure if he's just talking to me or if he wants me to share it with you guys. But, you know, my mama taught me to share, so you're welcome. Now, number two, I don't think for a minute to be any better than any of the stuff I'm going to talk about than any of you guys are. I'm like these guys in the video. I know I'm flawed. I'm just going to tell you what I think God has been telling me. And then number three, and this is built a little bit on what I talked about last time, which is that nothing today is designed to be a self-help strategy. Everything is designed to allow us to open our hearts and minds to let God transform us. It's not something we're supposed to do ourselves. So, that said, we can get into it. Last week, Joe talked a little bit about New Year's resolutions and what his New Year's resolutions were. And I don't know about you guys, but if you're like me, you have pretty much a flawless record of failure when it comes to New Year's resolutions. You know, every year I make them, every year I break them. Sometimes they're to me, sometimes they're my family, sometimes they're to God, and every year I fail. I noticed a scripture that I thought was interesting, which is from Solomon, who's in the video there, the wisest man who ever lived. You know, the break it in half. Boom, wisdom. I love that. So it's from Ecclesiastes 5:4. He says, "When you make a promise to God, don't delay in following through, for God takes no pleasure in fools." Wow, fools. It's pretty strong talk, right? So I think the message there is to be careful when we make promises to God or in front of God. Now, when it comes to habits in general, experts say that it takes about 2 weeks to create a habit. Today's the 12th of January, and I know that. Now, I know there's been other weeks up here where I didn't know what day it was, but today I know that it's the 12th. So we're right about kind of in that gray area where most of us have either crashed and burned or about to crash and burn on our resolutions. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what that would look like if we didn't give up like we usually do. And that's what I think is awesome about our God, that he's the God of second chances. And that's what you see on the cover of your bulletin. That I don't even know what you call that thing, the thing they use in Hollywood that they snap to take two. That's the subject, that's the title of the message. What? A clapper. There you go. I thought the clapper was the thing you turn your lights on and off with in the house. Anyway, there you go. So new word, the clapper. So I can. This is silly, but I can almost picture, you know, Jesus up in heaven in the director's chair, running the show, running the movie, and he's like, "Okay, stop." And he kind of says, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do it a little differently." He's got a little assistant guy, maybe Peter, maybe Paul, who operates the clapper. He comes in and says, "Take two," and Jesus says, "Action." That's kind of. I know it's silly, but that's kind of. Maybe that's just in my head, and that doesn't work for you guys. But my head is an odd place. So, but anyway, the central message of that opening video was pretty simple, right? It was, I mean, those guys, for the most part, were the kind of founding fathers, the pillars of our faith, and those guys were all deeply flawed. They did some really bad things, and God gave them second chances. And I think the reason, you know, that's important to us is he gave them second chances so that we could read about those second chances, and we could realize that God gives us second chances, and third chances, and fourth chances, and fifth chances, and that's really awesome. So again, last week Joe talked a little bit about his New Year's resolutions. So this week I'm going to talk about mine, and there's really only one of them. And I don't know if you guys want to hear it or not, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So my resolution for this year is I'm going to try to cut down to just one God. I don't know if you're still paying attention, but so what I mean by that is that I think my life a lot of times is filled with a lot of little gods that I think define me a whole lot more than my big God does. And if you look at, you know, look as simple as the Ten Commandments, the tablets, that you know, God tells us right there on the front of the commandments not to have any other gods before him and not to worship idols. And I think we all struggle with that, and that's why I looked up the words idol and I looked up the word worship in the Webster's dictionary. So I'll give you those. So an idol is a representation or a symbol of an object of worship, or broadly a false god. So it's whatever in your life shows you, whatever demonstrates as what's more important to you than God. That's an idol. Worship is the reverence offered to divine being or power. Also, extravagant respect, admiration for, or devotion to an object of esteem. So it's whatever your heart craves. So then, idol worship, right? It can be extreme devotion to a false god like Baal or Molech if you read in the Old Testament, or it can be devotion to a bunch of circuits in plastic with the logo of a familiar fruit on the outside of it. And so Apple users, and I gotta tell you, guilty. I did inventory this morning. We have at least 12 Apple products in my house. But If I do have 4 kids, so there's 6 of us. Don't judge me too much. So, but I was thinking, why are we all surprised at how addictive their stuff is, the Apple stuff is? They put the fruit that doomed Adam and Eve right there on the box, and it's the first thing it's the first thing you see when you boot it up. I mean, like, really, I know Scripture calls it a fruit, it doesn't really call it an apple, but church tradition does, so I like my metaphor. So really, anybody that's read past Genesis 2 should know why it should feel properly warned by Apple. They're not hiding it, man. They put it right out there for you. Put it right out there for you. So anyway, so idol worship involves extreme devotion to an object of esteem, but then how do you measure devotion? And I'm going to say that you measure devotion the same way Jesus did in Matthew 6:21 on the cover of your bulletins, where he said, where your treasure is, there your heart is as well. So I think what we're devoted to, where our hearts are, who and what we worship, that's what really defines how we use our time, talents, and treasures. We'll talk about that more in a second. But we all know that God has given us a set of unique talents, a set of unique gifts, and that He's asked us to use those as a service to Christ. Paul says that several times in his letters, and that's awesome. But I think that a lot of those very same gifts can become idols when we start to use those for our own glory instead of God's glory. When we start to use them for me, when they become more about me than they are about God. And I think that's a problem. And that's pretty much what I mean about trying to cut down to one God, to make sure that all my gifts and talents are focused on that one goal. So by now you guys probably know how much I like talking about Romans 12:1 and 2. The first time I was up here I talked about it, and you were thinking, well, gee, that's nice. And the second time I was up here and I talked about it, and you're probably thinking, well, guess he doesn't have anything else to talk about. And I'm going to talk about it for a second here again, and I hope that by now you're starting to think, I think he might be serious. And I am serious. And I say that because, nothing to me is more central than that idea of offering ourselves as a living sacrifice to God because of what He's already done for us, and that nothing enables that better than allowing ourselves to be transformed by the renewing power of God. So to me, everything, I think I can tie anything back to that. In fact, I wasn't going to talk about this, but years ago, Valerie and I were leaders down in a bigger church down in Virginia, and we went to this church growth conference, and they have all those little breakout deals. And we were in this breakout deal with the worship leader there, and this was when the whole video thing was getting big. And she said that Pastor Mike, their pastor, she said, Mike, he really only has one sermon, and it's my job to make it look different 52 times a year. And I didn't really get that until recently, but now I do get that. Like pretty much everything I decide to talk about comes back to the same point of transformation. So, that's the whole idea here, right? The transformation involves using our time, talents, and treasures in the best possible way. And a transformed life understands that grace isn't cheap. We talked about that last time with Dietrich Bonhoeffer. That grace is costly. Remember, we defined that as it's costly because it cost God the life of His Son, and it's grace because He was willing to pay the price for us. And that is amazing. That is so cool. I love that section. So we'll talk about time, talents, and treasures a little bit, take them in order. We'll start with time. So time, obviously, the things we spend our time on. I have a book that I'm going to peddle here, which written in the 1970s by a guy named Richard Foster. It's called Celebration of Discipline. It's a pretty fun-filled title, but it is an interesting book. What this does, he talks about the spiritual disciplines that most of you guys have probably heard of. There's 12 of them that he defines. He kind of broadly categorizes them into 3 categories: the inward disciplines of meditation, prayer, fasting, and study; the outward disciplines of simplicity, solitude, submission, and service; and the corporate disciplines, the ones we all do together, of confession, worship, guidance, and celebration. Now, what Foster says about these disciplines is where he really, where he gets me. Is he says, the central purpose of the spiritual disciplines is total transformation of the person. They aim at replacing the old destructive habits of thought with new life-giving habits. I read Romans 12 when I read that. So the practice of these 12 disciplines is how we give our time to God. And, obviously we're not going to have time to talk about all 12 of them because I have some other stuff I want to talk about. And I'm thinking I'll get you guys out of here around 1:30 Central Time. Joking. So I picked study out of those disciplines because I think for a lot of us, part of our New Year's resolutions, part of the ambitions we have for this year is to be a little bit better at studying the Bible. So I thought study would be a good one for us to talk about. So Foster says that all forms of study involve 4 basic steps, and those steps are repetition, concentration, comprehension, and reflection. Little side note here, this is really for the guys, I was rereading that chapter on Monday night while I was watching the BCS National Championship game, and I ran across this line, where Foster says, "We live in a culture that does not value concentration. Some will read a book and watch TV at the same time." Awkward. So when we open Scripture, we read Scripture, what we're looking for is transformation. We're not looking for information, right? Anybody can amass just piles of information. What we're looking for is to be transformed, Romans 12:2 style. And I think that's where his kind of disciplines come in here of repetition, concentration, comprehension, and reflection. They help us do that. They help us to open the Bible and get out of it what the author intended. I think a lot of us, when we open the Bible, what we're really looking for is validation of our own beliefs that we already have. We're trying to punt and peck through the Bible to find those things and say, oh yeah, look, that thing I'm already doing, that God is totally cool with that. And I don't think that's how we should approach the Bible. I think we should approach it trying to seek primarily the intent of the author first, which we do through repetition, concentration, comprehension, and reflection. So, time. So let's talk about talents for a second. And for that, we're going to look at one of Jesus' parables, the parable of the talents. It's not always called the talent, depending on what the translation you're using in the Bible, but it's in Matthew 25. And for those of you that may or may not know, obviously Jesus spoke a lot in parables. They're word pictures. They're hypothetical stories, but they're designed to illustrate just one single point. Every parable has just one single point. The point can have lots of different applications, so you can use it over and over again, but it's really the point remains the same. So we'll start in verse 14 here. It says, For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted them his property. Make sure we're all tracking here. The man going on the journey, God. The servants, you and me. Verse 15. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. That's important. So a talent, if you're wondering, is a unit of measure they used back in Jesus' day. Most people think it was a bag of silver, possibly gold, but a bag of silver. Experts generally think that it was a lot of money, that it would be more money than any servant would ever see in lifetime. I've seen estimates as much as a few $100,000. So the guy that's got 5 talents got a lot of money. Even the guy that got 1 talent, got a lot of money. So going back, end of verse 15, going into 16, then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them and made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents, made 2 talents more. But he who had received 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now remember, the master gave all 3 of them their talents according to their ability, meaning that he already knew that guy had the ability to do something with that 1 talent he gave him, but the guy chose not to. So verse 19. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you've delivered me 5 talents, and here I made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And also he who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered me 2 talents, here I made 2 talents more. The master said to him, Well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little, I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. So these 2 guys used the talents they were given, according to their ability, and they earned a return, earned for the kingdom, and they were recognized for it. They got an attaboy. So now let's look at the 3rd servant who was given just a single talent. This is verse 24. He also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But the master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you know that I reap where I have not sown, and I gather where I have not scattered seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received that which was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will be more given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So Jesus comes down pretty hard on this guy, right? But I got to tell you, I see a little bit of me in this guy. So he was given this huge responsibility, and he was afraid to blow it. He was afraid to mess it up, so he played it safe. He buried the talent on the ground. He kept it to himself so he could at least give back what was given to him. And I don't know about you, but I can totally identify with being a little scared. So one little point of clarification here at the end. Jesus is not saying that God is going to kick the poor when they're down. When he talks about that he, for the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. What he's talking about here is the people who do not use, who do not invest, who do not steward their talents correctly won't be given more. He's not saying that the poor will be cast out. So I heard a pretty cool quote the other day from an NBA superstar and committed Christian, Kevin Durant. He's kind of on a speaking tour along with playing basketball. His quote that he kind of centers every speaking engagement around is, "Hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard." And I love that quote, because he's saying that God's given us all talent, but he expects us to work hard with that talent. And I think that's the point of Jesus' parable. The parable isn't really about money. It's about stewarding. It's about working hard with what God has given you. It's about using our gifts for God. Each of those three servants was given a certain amount of talent. And again, that English translation is really cool here, because you can use it for talent in a bag of money, or talent, the gifts God's given us. And he was expected to use that talent wisely. And the two that used it wisely and they invested, made a return for the kingdom, those guys were praised. The guy that wasted, that squandered, that didn't use his talent, the one that chose not to work hard with his talent, he was the one that did not really get much love from God. So lastly, treasures. So I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Ron Solomon, McLean Bible Church. He does this little thing on secular radio that he calls Not a Sermon, Just a Thought. And I want you to keep that in mind here, because I'm not telling you to do or not to do any of the things that we're going to talk about in the next 5 minutes here. I'm going to talk about what I think God is telling me to do, and you can judge for yourself how that fits into your lives. So one of the things I did was I looked up some of the things that all of America, we all together, spend our money on what I would sarcastically call the bare necessities of life. So I've got a short list here I was going to go through. So Halloween. As a nation, we spend $7 billion a year on Halloween, 330 million of which is for our pets. On Easter, we spend $17 billion a year. I'm pretty sure most of that is on marshmallow peeps and chocolate bunnies and not on the death and resurrection side of Easter. St. Patrick's Day, and I don't know what to do with this one. St. Patrick's Day is $4 billion, which I can't think of anything but alcohol that people spend $4 billion on. I mean, I guess a few people buy those paper leprechaun hats, but pretty much I think it's just a night of binge drinking. So $4 billion on that. Go through a little faster here. Fast food, $117 billion a year. Beer, $96 billion a year. Soft drinks, $65 billion a year. Coffee, $11 billion. Pets and pet supplies, $51 billion a year. Lawn care, $40 billion. Gambling, $35 billion. Video games, $17 billion. Credit card late fees, and I'm not even talking about interest, I'm just talking about late fees. $18 billion a year Americans spend on late fees. And then these last two I threw in here because I just thought they were funny. Taxidermy, $800 million a year, and Twinkies, $600 million a year. $600 million a year on Twinkies. So the grand total of that impressive list here is about $440 billion. So yeah, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, so what? So here's the thing. I think those who love God use money for His glory, and those who love money try to use God for their glory. See, a lot of folks will tell you that Jesus said that money is the root of all evil. Well, there's several reasons He didn't. First of all, what He said was in the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Mount. He said that you can't serve two masters, God and money. The idea that money is the root of all evil, that actually came from Paul and Timothy. But even in 1 Timothy, I should say, even that, he said that the love of money is the root of all evil. He didn't say that money is the root of all evil. So what I take that to mean is that God doesn't necessarily want us to be poor, and God doesn't necessarily want us to be rich, the way some of the prosperity preachers would tell you that we would want you to believe. What He asks us to be is good stewards, to be smart with His money. So, to that end, an estimated 70% of the wealth of the Christian world, and I'm talking personal wealth here, not institutional church wealth, personal wealth, is concentrated right here in America. So God has given us the bulk of the wealth in the Christian world, and I think just like Jesus in the parable of the talents, I think He expects us to do something with that. So I'd never argue that a lot of good isn't already being done in the Christian community. It is. And I'm not suggesting that we eliminate any of those things on that list above. All I'm suggesting is that maybe we take a look, and if there's any room to maybe cut back on those things a little bit, maybe there's a better way we can invest some of that money to make an even bigger difference. So about a quarter of people in this country consider themselves to be evangelical Christians. So even if we let everybody else off the hook, That $440 billion, and our spending habits tend to look pretty much like the rest of America. That $440 billion is about $44 billion. So you take 1/4 of that. Sorry, got ahead of myself there. So 1/4 is about 110. And so I'm suggesting maybe that we take a look and see if we can cut out 10% out of those expenses. So that 110 billion becomes $11 billion. So $11 billion a year, I think, is low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, if I look back at that list of things, you know, fast food and soda and pet supplies and things like that, I don't think if God convicted me to do that, I don't think that would be hard to cut 10% out of that. But anyway, so that's $11 billion a year that just evangelical Christians in this country can muster. But let me give you an idea of what that could do. So global clean water and lack of sanitation is one of the biggest problems in the world, and it's the #1 killer in the developing world. They estimate it would cost $10 to $15 billion a year to make sure that everybody on this planet has clean water and sanitation. There's 11 billion of it right there. You know, a child dies in this world every 20 seconds based on a water-related illness, water-related disease. So in the time I'm up here talking, about 100 children will die based on lack of clean water. World hunger, that's a $30 billion problem, $30 billion a year. Obviously that's a lot of money. Not saying it's not a lot of money, but we do spend $51 billion on our pets. Global illiteracy, estimated that it would take $12 billion over 5 years to eliminate illiteracy in this world. And then lastly, this is one that's near and dear to my heart, and again, seems like low-hanging fruit to me, to fully fund all overseas missionary work, to make sure that missionaries didn't have to go panhandling from church to church to try to raise money for their trips, would take $1 billion a year. A meager $1 billion a year would fund all missionary work coming out of this country. So that's, looking at all that, studying that kind of caused me to think, and I don't know if it's gonna have any of the same effect on you. And again, it's more for me than it is for you. But so, you know, switching gears a little bit, I think it's fair to say that I love my life. I love my wife, I love my family, I love my job, I love my church family. I love pretty much everything about it in my life. But the one kind of depressing thing about being a middle-aged dude, am I still middle-aged or am I?
You're middle.
Okay, I'll call it middle. Like on the older edge of middle. So one of the things that's kind of depressing about that, though, is that most of the really big life decisions in my life have been made. They've kind of come and gone, right? So no matter how convicted I get about this stuff, time, talents, and treasures, I'm probably not going to quit my job and become a missionary. That's probably not going to happen. So in addition to my resolution for 2014, I have a word for 2014 too, and that word is margin. You know, margin, like the around the edges of the paper. What I figure is if I can't make big changes in my life, I figure I'll make little changes in my life, not like I was talking about a minute ago. I'll make little changes in my life and try to use what time, what talents, what treasures I free up with those little changes in a more positive way. So to that end, I have 5 things that I'm going to do to try to orient myself around that margin. Number 1 is to sweat the small stuff. Now, I think I'm using my time, talents, and treasures pretty well, but I'm also pretty sure I'm not. So what I think I need to do is I need to make better decisions. And so to that end, I've put together a little list for myself, and I actually had it printed on the back of the bulletin. I'm not suggesting that you have to do it. It's just out there as a suggestion if you want to do the same thing I'm doing. The left-hand column, what I'm doing, it's a time exercise. So in that box in the middle, I'm putting how much time I spend a week in communion with God, practicing the spiritual disciplines, you know, prayer, fasting, service, that kind of thing. How much time I spend a week doing that. And then all the other things that chew up my time during the week, I list above and below that based on their relative order. And on the right side, it's the same exercise with treasure. I'm going to write down how much I give a month to God, and I'm going to list all the things above it and below it, in the order of their how much money they are, right? And then I'm going to go back and pray about that, and I'm going to look at that, and I'm not going to be able to make drastic changes, but I think there's margin there. I think there's an opportunity to maybe use my time a little bit better. There's an opportunity to maybe use my money a little bit better, and that's where I think that can be found in the small stuff more than it can be found in the big stuff. So number 2 is fasting, another spiritual discipline. I got convicted about this one this week when I heard somebody say, in terms of kind of, again, transformation and training, is that if I can overcome eating, I can overcome anything. And that pretty much resonated with me, that would be a pretty good training aid. If I can discipline myself in that order, that would be a good thing to do. So I don't know what that's going to look like or how I'm going to do it, but I'm going to try fasting at some point in 2014, and it's not in between meals. That was my first idea. Yeah, I kind of said no to that one. Speaking of saying no, I'm also going to say no this year. So I think a lot of the demands on our time are things that aren't necessarily honoring to God or beneficial to others. A lot of times you get dragged into things that just really aren't that meaningful. And my hope for this year is I'm going to say no a lot. I'm going to pray with my family. And for me, what that's going to look like is I bought this little daily devotional book for a couples thing for my wife and I. And this, by the way, is a total setup. But she saw the book and she wasn't really into it. And now I can say, hey, talk about it in front of the church. We got into it. So it's a total setup. So we're going to do that. And then number 5 is that, and this may seem obvious to you, but I'm going to confess my sins to God every day. That too often I take His grace for granted, and I don't ask for forgiveness for every sin every day. And I'm going to try to be more intentional about that this year. I heard somebody say that good words make good actions make good habits, and good habits can change your destiny. And I think that's what those last 2 are about. They start with good words, and I'm hoping they'll make a difference in our lives. So since we're in school here, I wanted to talk about energy for a minute. Do we grab the other? We have the other video, the domino video. We can roll that. All right. While this thing is rolling, so you guys might remember from school potential and kinetic energy. All right. The potential energy is the energy that an object has based on its position or based on how its parts are arranged. It's inactive. And that kinetic energy is active energy. It's the energy associated with motion. So what's going on here is that as domino hits domino, potential energy is being converted into kinetic energy. And not surprisingly, I see Romans 12:2 again. I pretty much see that everywhere. So when we allow God to transform us, He releases the potential energy that's within us, the talents that are within us, and turn them into kinetic energy, into action. So I think a transformed life says to us that God says, don't just tell me you love me, show me you love me. I think that's what's going on here. And another great truth in this domino example, I think, is that each domino on its own has a very limited sphere of influence. The only domino that one domino can hit is the one right next to it. It's not going to hit the one a foot away or 10 feet away or at the end of the chain. It can only influence that one right next to it. But the dominoes working together can have far-reaching effects. And I think that a lot of times, this is me talking, is I think that I don't do anything because I think that I can not do everything. And then I think all I really have to do is that one thing that's right next to me, to hit that one domino that's right next to me, and that maybe that way we can change the world. And one other little line for you that I like this week is from Mark Batterson at NCC, Church in D.C. He said, if you're still breathing, God's not done using you. I think that's appropriate here too. You know, most of us are never going to be a guy like Rick Warren that's influenced millions, maybe tens of millions of people. But our aim should be to do what these dominoes did. That we should just use our gifts and talents to influence the domino that's closest to us. So as we start to wind down here, I'm going to tell you 2 quick second chance stories. Remember, we're God of second chances. The first story is about a guy named Chuck Colson. You guys, most of you guys may be familiar with Chuck. He was the founder of Prison Fellowship Ministries International. He was a Watergate figure, which we'll get into in a minute. But you may not know kind of the whole extraordinary story of his life, so I want to give you a quick hit on that. So Chuck was born in 1931 in a lower middle class family in Boston. He had drive, he had talent, he had ambition, and he also had a chip on his shoulder. At age 11, think about this, at age 11 during World War II, he organized a fundraising drive to buy a new Jeep for the American troops. He received 2 scholarship offers. One was for Harvard, and the other was a Navy ROTC scholarship for Brown. And he, in his own words here, turned down Harvard just for the chance to turn them down. That was the chip on his shoulder that I talked about. After getting out of Brown, he went to the Marine Corps through his Navy ROTC. He became the youngest captain in the history of the Marine Corps. After his time in the Marines, he went to GW Law School at night, and he worked during the day. He had political ambitions, loved politics, went to work in the Nixon administration, where most of you guys may know the name from. Anybody that knew him will tell you that he was a take-no-prisoners bully. He was not a nice guy. When it all started crashing around him in the Watergate scandal, I think a lot of people, I've read that a lot of people really loved the idea that Chuck was going to get what was coming to him, and he was going to get his payback. Right in the midst of that Watergate scandal, Chuck had a conversion experience, and I think there's more than a few people that kind of raised an eyebrow with. Here we have kind of the biggest jerk and the most corrupt administration in American history finding Jesus just when it was kind of the most opportune for him. So I think a lot of people didn't really take that seriously. So Chuck was sentenced to 2 to 3 years in prison, and he went to prison determined to be a witness for Jesus. That didn't work out all that well right away. It took him a little time to get going. The verse that he kind of focused himself around, oriented himself around, was Hebrews 2:11. It says, "Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family." So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. So for him, that was a reminder that he's no better than his fellow inmates, and we're all the same in the eyes of Christ. So in January 1975, some of his co-conspirators were getting released from jail, and he had gotten turned down for early release, and his spirits kind of hit rock bottom. His son had gotten arrested for drug possession, and he was really at rock bottom. And at the urging of a family friend, he did something that he'd been, up to that point, unwilling to do, which was to kind of fully let go and turn all of his problems over to God. He prayed this prayer. He said, "God, if this is what this is all about, then I thank you. I praise you for leaving me in prison, for letting them take away my license to practice law, yes, even for my son being arrested. I praise you for giving me your love through these men, for being God, and for just letting me walk with Jesus." What Chuck could not have known is that at that same time, his lawyer was appealing to the judge to get Chuck a 10-day furlough to go out and visit his son, who, as I said, had just gotten arrested. The judge, for reasons that no one understands, went that request one better and granted Chuck a full and permanent release from prison. So, I mean, within hours or days of Chuck giving up and turning it over to God, he was released from prison. Now, what's interesting is, he left prison, reunited with his family, ministered to his son, but within 1 week, he was back in that prison, this time as a visitor, hosting the Bible studies, leading the inmates that he was leading before. And a couple months later, Chuck says he was staring into his bathroom mirror, and God gave him a revelation. And he had, this is his words, a vision of smiling men and women streaming out of prisons with Bibles and study groups around tables. He said he'd never experienced anything like that before or since. And he said heard an almost audible voice telling him to take the prisoners out, teach them, return them to prisons, to build Christian fellowships, and to spread these fellowships to every penitentiary in America. He didn't know really what that meant. The kind of idea of taking prisoners out seemed pretty unlikely, right? But he worked through some channels, worked through some friends, and within a few months, Prison Fellowship Ministries was born. And what that ministry began with was federal inmates being taken out of prison for a 2-week furlough in D.C. to learn Bible study, leadership training, and then being sent back into prison to minister to their fellow inmates. So that was exactly the vision that he had of taking prisoners out and sending them back in. And over time, that has now grown to a ministry that incorporates over 100 groups, and they work in over 120 countries. But never wanted to be satisfied. As Prison Fellowship took off, Chuck became convicted that one of the problems that led to all of the suffering he saw in prison was a lack of a Christian worldview, a lack of a moral framework from childhood. He started a radio broadcast called Breakpoint. At its heyday, it had about 8 million daily listeners. He also started a ministry called Angel Tree, which organized folks to give gifts to the families of the inmates. So here he's ministering to the families of the inmates that are without their fathers, without their mothers, without their sons and daughters. Chuck passed away in 2012, but obviously he's left behind a legacy that's going to live on forever. Chuck was a great man, but he'd be the first to tell you that he wasn't a good one. I think Chuck Colson 1.0 was a bully and a jerk, but the God of second chances gave us Chuck Colson 2.0. And he waited, like he always does, until Chuck's lowest moment, until he had given up hope, to set Chuck free. Chuck knew that redemption, that God can save people of all different shapes and sizes, and that he knew that God can reach down into the depths of humanity and pull out something beautiful. And he knew that when we accept Christ, that God frees us to live for him, not to live without him. So as we kind of wrap it up here, I'm going to tell you one more quick story. And as I do that, I'm going to invite the band up to start setting up. So there's going to be a very short bio here of a guy named John Newton while the band comes out on stage. Some of you may or may not know John Newton by name, but you know him. And he's not the guy with the apple that fell on his head. That was Isaac Newton. I was wrong. So John was born in 1725 in London spent his early years as a slave trader. He's a cold, dark, and brutal man, according to the people that knew him. In 1747, he's said to have a conversion experience during a storm at sea, and it took about 20 years for him to kind of evolve from the slave trader into an Anglican minister. In 1764, he took his first parish as an Anglican minister. On New Year's Day, New Year's Day, I'm making pretty old. On New Year's Day, 1773, he preached a sermon that included this amazing picture of God's grace. He said, "He has dealt with us according to the estate of a man of high degree. He found us upon the dunghill, and he has made us companions of princes in the wilderness, and has led us to the city of God." Newton had one more interesting habit. He liked to write hymns to accompany his sermons. On that day, the hymn that he wrote began with these words: "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see." And there, my friends, you have the life and legacy of a slave trader turned abolitionist turned preacher, John Newton. Take it away.